For purpose of the recording here, the host said, well, let's just play it again. I neglected to record it. Let me say it again, play it again for the audio on here.
What do you want to be when you grow up as a grown man?
An actor and an artist.
An actor in motion pictures? Let me give you a little test. Have you ever done any acting?
Yeah.
Well, try it. Say Art Linkletter like you're mad.
Art Linkletter like you're mad.
That's good. You're going to be one.
So we identified that the child was focused on like you're mad and interpreted that differently than the rest of us did, right? Mm-hmm. The grown-up interpretation is, what about like you're mad? That it is a description of what?
An accent, like how you feel.
What exactly did he say? I didn't really understand him.
Oh, here, the host says to the boy, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the boy, and I'm paraphrasing, the boy says, I want to be an actor or an astronaut or something. I forget what the second one was. But I want to be an actor. The host says, the grown-up says, have you ever done any acting? And somebody says, I think he lied, but I don't know if that's lying, but he says yes. The boy says, I have done acting. He didn't say that. Have you ever acted before? The boy says, yes. He says, well then, we're going to try you out, test it out. I want you to say, what was the phrase before, like you're mad? Oh, so he's essentially telling the boy, say my name like you're mad. Say Art Linkletter. Yeah, the host name is Art Linkletter. Okay. So say, which I see can be confusing because Linkletter, it sounds like it's some wacky test or something, the Linkletter test. Say Art Linkletter like you're mad. And we've all agreed that like you're mad is the thing that confused the child. And the adults are interpreting it to mean show us how you say Art Linkletter with a certain type of emotion, the emotion being anger. But the boy sees it as simply a direction. Precisely. Just repeat what I say. Can you do that? Like that's acting, repeating what I say. In some sense, that's what acting is. I guess you get a script, you repeat what the script says. But it's obviously more than that, and emotions are a big part. So the confusion is we want the boy to express something with a particular kind of emotion. The boy sees it as a directive to simply repeat what the questioner says. That's an example of kids being very literal, and you'll see that. Kids being literal happen all the time, and we need to be vigilant. We need to pay attention to those times that it does happen so that we can reframe and question the child in a way that makes sense to their linguistic development. You'll see we're going to look at an example that was among your multimedia for today where a boy confuses underwear and boxers and briefs and all that. Did we talk about that the first class, boxers and briefs?
No.
Okay. We're going to take a look at that clip in a moment. And again, the boys being very literal, children being very literal, are something that we need to pay attention to all the time. It's a common problem among kids. They don't get the nuances of words. They don't get sarcasm. Okay, I used to tell Daniel as he slobbered over his breakfast cereal, why don't you just stick your head in the milk? Which he then took his head and stuck it down into the milk. Now, I was being sarcastic. He was being literal, right? And that's the way kids are. And I think that captures what that boy was being very literal, at least in a sense.
Do you think because of their maturity level, their perception is so direct? So when they're younger, like if you tell them to sit, they'll sit. So they don't understand the different meanings of words or the different dialogues that you, as an adult, you might have with a child.
You're exactly right, and that's the issue. They want to please adults. They're very direct and they're very literal, and they're going to do what you say, and they're not going to appreciate the nuances and meanings, and what linguists call meta messages, META messages. You don't really have to worry about that, but it simply means the hidden message, if you will, or the not obvious message of a statement from one person to the other. There's a book by a linguist named Deborah Tannen, and it actually is kind of fun reading if you're into this stuff, but it's entitled, "That's Not What I Meant," or something like that. I can bring it up on the internet in a little while. That's not what I meant. And she goes through 20 chapters of describing how language, even in adult interactions, even especially among intimate partners, right? We say one thing to our intimate partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, but we mean something else, right? We sometimes say, so you want to go to the party? And in the manner in which we say it suggests it sounds like you don't want to go to the party. So the manner in which we say things, and that's not the best example, but there are a lot of them when we talk to intimate partners where we say something, we mean something quite different. And that's a meta message, and you'll see more of that as we go along. Kids don't get that. They're very direct and very literal. You're 100% correct. Let's see what happens next.
Thomas, what do you think you'll be when you grow up?
A bus driver or a pilot.
A bus driver or a pilot?
Yes.
Well, suppose you were a pilot on a big airplane and suddenly all 4 engines stopped right away. What would you say?
Here comes the joke. But I wanted to stop it here because we're making an assumption now. What's the assumption that the questioner is making right before he says "Our Father," the beginning of "Our Father"?
That the plane's going down. That the child knows that the plane.
Yes. That not only that the plane's going down, but that the child knows that the plane's going down. That suddenly all 4 engines stop. What would you do? Now, the child hears that, but he has to make the cognitive leap that that means the plane's about to crash. Maybe the plane's got 8 engines. Maybe he doesn't even know what the engine does to the plane, right? But we do that all the time. We make assumptions about the word choices that we make and how children perceive them. So that question really, how could we have said that question in a more direct way to the child, a more appropriate way to the child, so there's no misunderstanding? He knows what the question means. He doesn't have to then go, well, what does 4 engines malfunctioning lead to?
What would you do if the plane broke down?
Right, and was about to crash or something. Would be even more direct. Yes, if the plane broke down. If the plane broke down is rather clear. He says, what would you do if the plane lost all 4 engines? Again, I'm paraphrasing. And you have to be able to figure out what that means to a pilot. But yes, so the way to remedy that is to say, what if the kid looks at you, I don't know. What? You know what, Jeremy? What would you do if you were a pilot and the plane broke down and couldn't fly anymore and was about to crash? Right? So that would be more specific. So everything we say, in the context in which we say it, in the manner in which we say it, matters. I'm not so sure what this kid heard. It sounds silly, his response. It sounds like things that people might do if they knew the plane was about to crash. So he probably got that. And I don't know if he was prepped, because this is a rather, in the age of reality TV, none of those shows are real, None of them. They're fun. They're real people, but they're scripted. They tell them what to do. Oh, you got this letter. This is what you're going to do. You're going to act angry. You're going to act surprised. And there you have the real, whatever, housewives, dog walkers of New Jersey, whatever. Doesn't matter what it is. It's a show. Porn. I like those porn stars, How could you have a pawn shop and every day somebody comes in with something really cool? I mean, it doesn't happen, right? Oh, this was used by in World War II and porn stars.
Sorry,
There you
I
go.
apologize.
That was one right there.
An auditory discrimination error?
I was shocked. I was just like,
Yeah.
Oh no, porn. No, that's an
Oh my God.
that's an auditory discrimination error. I said porn. You heard it as something spelled differently and meaning something quite different.
I got scared.
Our Father, which art in heaven.
So he would begin to pray. I'm not sure. That sounds like he may have understood it exactly, and his first response would be to pray, because God would save him rather than try to fix the plane. Excuse me.
Mark Sheverton, what's the hardest thing about school for you?
Okay, stop it there. Where's a homonym at the beginning of the question?
Hardest.
Hardest could be diamonds or hard, right? Or hard can mean difficult. and maybe a few other things. Now, that doesn't mean kids don't get all these things. I mean, that this is a word that probably the average 6 or 7-year-old does get, and I think he does. But nevertheless, he starts out with a word that has multiple meanings, the interviewer.
For you,
Button in my pants.
I'll bet you before you came down here, they all gave you orders today, didn't they? Very important before you come on a coast-to-coast show. Paula Brown, what did your parents tell you?
To keep my legs together.
When Jesus made the water into wine at the wedding, that's the story. What do we learn from that story?
We learned the more wine we get, the better the wedding is.
Now, that's rather silly and fun and works. I'm not so sure that a 7-year-old would say that without prep. So I wonder about the Art Linkletter show as we experts analyze this stuff here. And he's making a colossal assumption when he asked the last little girl about the wedding at Canaan. I'm showing my little bit of biblical knowledge. I think it was Canaan. She might not even be a Christian. What does she know about that story? Right? So that's a giant assumption that she knows that story about. It's a biblical story. But there didn't seem to be, assuming she does, her response was silly and funny, but I don't think it reflected any problem with the language of his words. Did you see anything in there? No, I don't think so. But a funny response nonetheless. Oh, was there another one? I don't think so. No, it's just the exit. All right. Very good. So that's a little bit about language. We'll get more into language with the next learning module. I want to touch upon a couple of things from the first lecture, which you have to listen to. We missed it because of the snowstorm. But two of the things that we hit upon in that lecture are the models for assessing child sexual abuse and the history of suggestibility. May I look at your book? Not this one, the bottom one. Thank you. Now that comes right out of chapter 3 in Professor Fowler's book, the first topic that we discussed in the first lecture. Now, for our purposes, I want you to contrast the two major models for interviewing children that are relevant to us. Professor Fowler talks about the child interview model, the joint investigation model, the parent-child interaction model, the comprehensive assessment model, and she compares and contrasts those. For our purposes, and what I want you to take away here is there are two different types of investigative interviews of children, and that word can be a little tricky as well, investigative. But what we do, when I say we, I'm a former member of law enforcement and a prosecutor, and many of you are DCP&P workers, and some of you may have been assigned to field-level investigative units like intake, right? And you go out to find out what happened. In order to find out what happened, you need to question people, you need to look at environments, you need to document things, you need to question people, and you gather information. You investigate. And that's one way of interviewing kids, right? Models for assessing child sexual abuse. That's one way to assess child sexual abuse and child physical abuse, or any kind of abuse and neglect, whatever it is. The other model is the clinical model. And that's when a therapist or an evaluator or a mental health practitioner asks questions and investigates the same set of facts in order to respond in a clinical way or from a mental health perspective. And I want you to appreciate that the investigative interview, the one that law enforcement, cops, prosecutors, DCP&P, child protection workers does, is concerned above all with the truth. We're interested in what really happened, and we're interested in getting the child to express to us the historical truth, what happened in the past, to the best of their ability. And then we attempt to corroborate that or find other evidence or other information that supports whatever the child said and other witnesses said. But at the end of the day, we're concerned with the historical truth. Because once we find out our best, it's never perfect, far from it, understanding of what happened in the past, we can take future action. Whether it be separating the child from the dangerous situation, the caregiver's ineptitude, their neglect, their violence, place them in a foster home, place them in a kinship situation, or maybe just remedy the situation by working with the caregiver, yet they still live in the house with the child. A lot of things that DCP&P can do, right, based upon what really happened. Law enforcement, same thing. The end game there is to hold people accountable for bad behavior, also to rehabilitate them and try to make sure that doesn't happen again. You know, as a prosecutor, I'm concerned about that. But it's also punitive, so we also punish people for bad things they do. But again, the punishment they get, right, or whatever counseling we ask the judge to order, or whatever kind of remediation or intervention that a prosecutor or law enforcement would ask the court for, whatever that may be, it depends upon the historical truth, if it really happened or not, and how it happened. So either way, DCPP and law enforcement are concerned about what really happened in the past. And this is just one distinction. It's a major one, but only one. Professor Fowler goes over a few. Mental health professionals are more interested in the impact upon the child's emotions, psychology, right? Whether it really happened or not is important to them, but not critical. Even if it didn't really happen, how the child perceived what happened is most important to the mental health professional. The mental health professional wants to deal with the child's, or whoever their client or patient is, wants to deal with their patient's mental health issues so that they can function better and not do the same things over again. So if a child feels that daddy did X, and that's not really how it happened, that's not so important to the mental health professional. There isn't the premium placed on the truthfulness of the child's experience as there is in law enforcement and child protection. There, we want to do the best we can to find out what really happened. You know, if the mental health professional only gets half the story or some of it is the child's misperceptions, that tells them something. Well, I know 20 witnesses here say that the father will simply raised his hand but never swung it at the child. But if the child feels that he swung it at her, that's something the child has to live with, even though it's how the child felt and not the total truth. You follow how mental health professionals are not as bogged down into what really happened as we in law enforcement and child protection are. So that's one difference in assessing child abuse. The other thing is child protection and law enforcement typically have one shot at finding out what happened with the child. Now, you can do multiple interviews of a child, but that is you reach a point rather quickly of diminishing returns with that. We know in law enforcement and child protection that the best way to get the most information and the most accurate information is to interview a child on multiple occasions by a single experienced, trained forensic interviewer. Law enforcement and child protection gets that if you interview a kid 2 or 3 times, you're going to get more information and have a more complete picture. But we don't have the luxury of doing that. If we interviewed every child we had 3 times, 4 times, the system would bog down. It's not really the environment for getting the primary information so we can take action, immediate action in most cases. So that doesn't mean that we don't get the story. It's just that you get a fuller story with multiple interviews. But I tell you this, you get enough of a story to take action with a single interview. And you can do a second interview, but it's very rare. And in law enforcement, we rarely do a second interview. I train people with this child first finding words protocol. We don't recommend a second or third interview for the reasons I just said. But the more that you interview the child with the same interviewer, you don't bring in another clinician and a third clinician. That creates nothing but problems. It's better to interview the child once rather than with 3 different people. Never do that. Although it happens, not by design, but if you have control over the interview process, you certainly don't interview the child multiple times with different interviewers. Yes?
My uncle just died.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm sorry. It's okay. Do you want someone to walk you out?
I'm
walk her out.
You sure? Go ahead. I'm so sorry. Okay. So, the mental health professional is not interested in historical truth as much as law enforcement and child protection. The other thing that law enforcement and child protection is, we interview the child once rather than multiple times. The payoff isn't enough for us to do it multiple times, and it would be very difficult for the systems to engage in multiple interviews. You get enough information in a single interview if it's done competently and appropriately. Okay, so that's another difference in the models for assessing child abuse. Although Professor Fowler talks about 3 or 4 different ones here, I want to focus on the difference between a mental health evaluation, right, and a forensic interview that you guys do and that I do and that law enforcement does. Okay? Go ahead. Mental health evaluation versus a forensic interview. Mental health evaluation typically is 2 or 3 or more by a single mental health professional, where the truth, the historical truth, is not as important. Where for the police and for child protection, the truth matters big time. So those are the kind of differences, and they're the 2 common ones. Now, within your practice as DCP&P workers, you may have the opportunity, especially with real little kids, but it doesn't matter what the age of the child is, to refer that child to the Regional Diagnostic and Treatment Center. In Essex County, it would be the Winona Littman Center. In Passaic County, it would be the Audrey Hepburn Children's House. In Middlesex County, it would be the program over at St. Peter's. In South Jersey, down in Camden County, it would be the program at NJ Cares. Nevertheless, you would send the child out with for what used to be called a trauma assessment. Okay? There are other words to describe this process, a mental health evaluation, if you will, also called a trauma assessment, and a couple of other things, child sexual abuse evaluation. You know, that's kind of the operative word, evaluation. And that would be what the clinician does.
Professor,
Yeah.
in the reading, when you mentioned the health evaluation and the forensic interview, didn't they just state that sometimes they will not agree because one wants to treat, you know, whatever happened, and the other one wants to know, like, what actually happened. So they kind of like contradict with each other's work?
Yeah, I don't know about contradicting or but they have a different purpose, and
Okay, maybe
they may come
not
to...
the right word, but it's just,
Yeah, well, there's a different outcome, that's for sure. Now, they could disagree. The trauma assessor, the mental health professional, can say, I think there's enough information to take action. I think the child was abused or neglected or sexually abused. And law enforcement may say, I don't think there's enough. Or child protection may say, I don't think there's enough. Or the child's a little sketchy on this point. So the parties can disagree. The law enforcement and child protection can disagree. There can be disagreement between child protection, law enforcement, and mental health. So they can come to different results. But again, mental health's purpose is different. Now, they're going to give their opinion to child protection. They're going to tell DCP&P, this is what we think, especially the regional diagnostic centers. You guys contract with them. You want to know their opinions. So you're essentially paying for their opinions. So you can have different outcomes and different beliefs. But at the end of the day, they want to treat that child and make sure that child is able to function normally to the best they can. You know, they don't have nightmares. They can go to school. They can concentrate. Whatever it is that the trauma can do to the functioning of a human being, the mental health professional wants to minimize, right? Law enforcement, we care about the child, don't get me wrong, but we're not worried about the impact of trauma. We're worried about what the bad guy did and punishing them, and making sure it doesn't happen again. You're in the make sure it doesn't happen again business, and make sure it doesn't happen to the siblings and anybody else in that circle of risk. But the mental health professionals, they're going to work with this patient and try to get them functioning normally and minimize the impact of the trauma. So, they're different in that aspect. There are different models for assessing child abuse. We touch upon them in our practice. The average intake worker's using the law enforcement model. You're trying to get evidence of what really happened. Because in the end, whether you're going under a child welfare theory or a child abuse theory, you still have to convince the fact finder, the judge, that this happened. The government just can't pop into people's lives for no reason or because you think something happened. You got to have some level of proof to go in somebody's life and make them do anything in this country. And the way to do that is to investigate a case with a forensic perspective. That's not what mental health professionals do. They do something else that's very important as well. The other thing that's talked about in this lecture is the history of suggestibility, and I'm not going to go over that, but there's a reading for you, and I talk about it in the lecture as well. There's not a lot of research on the impact of suggestibility until about the 1970s, specifically the impact of suggestibility on children. This is something we deal with in great detail later on in this semester. But in the first class, what I wanted to do was introduce you to the concept of adults' questions misleading children or impacting their memory of what happened to them. The way we ask questions, the words that we use when we ask questions, can impact the child's memory of what happened, sometimes in a negative way, sometimes distorting that memory, and sadly, in very rare cases, but ones we have to be mindful of, changing their memories of what happened. This chapter, the first lecture, was about, was there ever research on this? Did they ever experiment with kids and figure out, what are the boundaries of good questions and bad questions? Can kids be misled? Can they have false memories or distorted memories? That research, we trace suggestibility generally back to the 18th century. There's an article you read, and there's a little bit of a discussion of it in this lecture here. And the one thing that I focus on is a guy named Franz Mesmer. Franz Mesmer is in the article that you read. He was a guy in 18th century France that went around suggesting that he could cure people's ailments. He could make people feel better by adjusting their animal magnetism, which even back then the French government was skeptical of. Here you have this guy going around healing people. Is he for real, or he's some phony who's taking advantage of the people? And he would collect money, and what was even more disturbing to the French government was he was a bit of a character. He wore these long flowing robes with moons and stars on them, and he had a staff, and he'd wave the staff by you, and he would put his arm on your shoulder, and he would adjust your animal magnetism.
Was it the one with the crystals that they said?
There may have been crystals involved too. I forget what other props he used, but they were props nonetheless. There was no animal. It was made up. There's no animal magnetism. But in the 18th century, no one knew that, and people were leaving there saying, "This guy rocks. He knows what he's doing. I feel better." And person after person, not everybody, mind you, but many anecdotal accounts of Franz Mesmer's healing were getting around the French countryside. So the French government started a commission to investigate this dude. And they put together the smartest people in France when it came to kids and suggestibility and the law and science. And they investigated Franz Mesmer. And it turns out that what he was doing had nothing to do with animal magnetism. People were feeling better, but they were feeling better because he did what? What did he do to them to make them feel better? What did the commission conclude was the thing that made people feel better? Some of his patients, we'll call them patients, some of his clients feel better.
He suggested that they didn't have the illness anymore.
Yeah, suggestibility. And more importantly, hypnosis almost. They didn't call it hypnosis back then, but the suggestion over and over again that you're feeling better, that your stomach doesn't hurt anymore, that all the pain is leaving you. And then you got this guy with the cape on and the robes, and he's got the staff, and people buy into stuff. The human mind is very powerful, and people can suggest things to us that have a physical impact. And the conclusion was that Mesmer's suggestions and the significant suggestibility that he employed created the perception and the belief by the patients or the clients that they felt better, and then in fact they did feel better. And he did it in such a rigorous, kind of methodical, kind of ritualistic way, keep your eyes, watch this, look at this, that it became what later we called hypnosis. And it was really a form of hypnosis that Mesmer was using, although they didn't call it that then. There's a word that arose from this character running around France in the 1700s that we use till today. It's not used that much in everyday language, but it is still a word that arises from his name that is almost a synonym for hypnotism. You rock. Yes, mesmerized from the name Franz Mesmer. And it's kind of like, you ever see these things? People are prone to share them on Facebook now, these things. But the 10 or 15, 20 years ago, in the mall, they would have these bizarre-looking prints, like a poster, and you had to stare at it. You're like, well, you're I used to never be able to see the thing. I thought I was something wrong with me. Stare. If you keep staring, you can see an eagle flying with a dog in its beak. All I see is a bunch of squiggly lines. But if you stared long enough and almost became mesmerized, there it was. So we can thank Mr. Mesmer. With regard to suggestibility studies, there were a few after Mesmer, and Mesmer wasn't a pure suggestibility study, but we learned a little bit about suggestion. And, later on in the 19th century and even in the 20th century, hypnotism became fashionable, right? And there's nothing more suggestible than hypnotism. That's the whole point of hypnosis, to suggest things to you over and over again, to tap into your subconscious. Yes?
Is that permissible in court?
Well, you would think that it wouldn't be, since it's so wacky to me, hypnosis. I mean, come on. Now, I'm not saying it can't have an impact, and it can't be fun to do, and it can stop people from smoking and do other things. Suggestion power is very strong. But courtrooms are not in the suggestion power, and people like going off and dissociating and then coming up with conclusions. Having said that, there are, even in New Jersey, which is very conservative when it comes to the law, there's a case called State versus Hurd, H-U-R-D, which allowed, now I don't know whether if they revisited this issue, the New Jersey courts of 2014, this was maybe 30 years ago, would allow it, but they allowed hypnotically refreshed testimony, where a woman who got assaulted in a stranger assault, maybe a rape, or I forgot what the hell happened to her, but she was attacked. And she had a little tough time remembering some of the facts and who the bad guy was. She went to a hypnotist who put her through hypnosis, and she was able to remember more details, which helped catch the bad guy. Now, and the court said that's okay if you do this, that, and the other thing. Those are dangerous waters that the court's in. But in answer to your question, as of today, my understanding is that hypnotically refreshed recollection is admissible in New Jersey courts, provided that there's a 2-day hearing ahead of time, and the hypnotist testifies, the subject testifies, a bunch of experts come in. You really got to tell the judge exactly what went down. As a prosecutor, I don't know that I would ever use such a process. It really seems to be a lot of work just to create something for the defense. If I was a defense lawyer, I would be all over this. I would treat it like junk science. I would be skeptical of it. I would demean it. And I don't want to be a prosecutor in that situation where my witness is going to get cross-examined and have tomatoes thrown at her for an hour and a half in front of a jury because I had her go to a hypnotist. I mean, many people's perceptions of the hypnotist is, they may still even have these on college campuses. Ooh, the sexy hypnotist, the X-rated hypnotist, the wacky hypnotist. They get you to come in and sing Madonna songs as a chicken and sometimes do silly, sexually suggestive things. They had comedians that do this. So, hypnotism's a little funky to admit in a courtroom, but they allow it. But arising from Mesmer was kind of a hypnosis movement. Now, remember, Mesmer was the 18th century, the 1700s. The 1800s, and even later in the 1900s, people realized that suggestibility can be useful and powerful. And, the court of law is a very specific place. Very few people in life wind up in a court of law. Most of humanity winds up in municipal court at most for a traffic ticket. I spent my whole career in Superior Court. Very few people wind up in Superior Court. because of some litigation. Very rare. So we don't have to throw hypnosis in the garbage can because it doesn't fit in the courts. It can be a good thing. And they use hypnosis to help kids study better in the 1800s. They thought. They use hypnosis to encourage good behavior and positive behavior. They even use hypnosis today to do what? Some of you may have even, I had a friend, lose weight. What's another thing? Stop smoking. Still, they use hypnosis to deter or minimize negative behavior, right? And even to this day, you know, I had a colleague, a captain in the child abuse unit. He had a staple in his ear, and he did hypnosis. You got a staple, acupuncture, hypnosis, whatever it takes. The point is that hypnosis is a very specific kind of remedy for bad behavior that's even used till today. It involves repeated suggestion. And we can learn about that. We're concerned about, with our kids, we're concerned about the impact of repeated suggestion on children's memories of being abused. And if somehow those memories are distorted by repeated suggestion, then we got a problem, not only in the criminal courts, but within the family courts that DCP&P practices in child protection. So one of the things we looked at was the history of suggestibility. We got modern research on this, but I want you to dip your toes in the water and get a sense of what we're talking about here when it comes to suggestibility, and look at what kind of research there was before the modern research. Observation? Comment?
Yeah, I guess.
Tomato to throw?
No, not to use something.
That's easy.
So in terms of suggestibility, I'm just thinking, I know that let's say we do as DCP&P workers, we get a case or whatnot, but then we have so much of a time frame at times, depending on when the situation happened. Do you think that has a big impact besides suggestibility, time?
You're asking me if the fact that you have an immediate response obligation and very rigorous window of investigation, whether the fact that it's rushed and immediate, I'll call it rushed, that's a term that's loaded, the fact that it has to happen in a certain window of time and immediately, whether that impacts on the outcome?
Right.
Listen, it could. Not inherently. Simply having to do something in 24 hours does not automatically make the outcome of your investigation worse than had you had 3 days, but it could. And suggestibility doesn't simply mean that a child got it wrong. You could be suggestive and the child remembers what happened and doesn't bite. Remember, we're not like Franz Mesmer. We're not waving wands and look at me, think Daddy put his hand on your head, Daddy put his hand on your head, think about it, come back tomorrow, Daddy. I mean, that's not our suggestibility. Waving our hand, putting it on their shoulder, whatever. That's not what happens with the worst interviewer. So could suggestibility by the interviewer impact on the recollection of the child? Yes. Could the squeezed time frame that DCP&P has to operate in, and law enforcement, impact the outcome? Yeah, it could. It could. Look, anytime you have to do something real fast, people get sloppy, right? And cut corners. It's just human nature. You got to resist the urge to do that. And be very mindful of what you do. And the way you do that is with practice and teaching and learning and studying and experience. Go ahead.
We learned last semester about the whole daycare cases that occurred.
Yeah.
I guess that was the late 80s to early 90s.
Yeah, you took children in justice?
Yeah.
No, we have that now.
We have that now. We took it under,
It was Intro to Child
Intro to
Abuse.
Child
Kelly
Abuse.
Michael.
Oh, yeah, they talked about Kelly Michaels in Intro to Child Abuse?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Flexibility of kids,
Yeah.
and how you interview them, and how you can easily, lead people down the wrong path.
Sure. We're gonna meet Kelly again. I got some video of Kelly, Margaret Kelly Michaels. Margaret Kelly Michaels.
Oh, Mark.
Is that your name, Margaret?
No.
Okay. Anyway, we're going to meet Kelly Michaels again, and you're exactly right. Margaret Kelly Michaels is an example of an institutional child sexual abuse investigation. It has these kinds of cases have certain elements that we will talk about in common. Kelly Michaels, the McMartin case in California, you'll read about in depth. The Little Rascals Daycare Center in North Carolina, you'll read about. Fell Acres is another institutional investigation involving a daycare center. all of them focused on, the court focused on the impact of suggestibility. And we will learn eventually, we're looking at the history of suggestibility right now, but when we look at suggestibility, I think it might be about 3 weeks we do it here. When we look at suggestibility in this course with me, we're going to look at those cases and how interviewers can be suggestible and how to minimize suggestibility. You're 100% right. And the history of suggestibility is Mesmer, the hypnosis stuff. And in 1979 was the first time, the late 70s, was the first time that child advocates, scientists, researchers in universities like Montclair State and others said, you know what? Let's take a look at the impact of questioning upon children's memories. Are we too suggestible was one of the questions that was asked in 1979 by Gail Goodman and a number of her colleagues. And Goodman spearheaded this research. There were a couple of experiments that this woman, Gail Goodman, wasn't involved in. And you'll see when I teach you that most of the research showed that kids aren't as vulnerable as we thought. You know, despite the fact that the interviewer may have been suggestive and the dynamics of the interview may have been flawed in some way, not ideal, not optimum, the kids didn't have false recollections. They got things right. They did experiments with clowns and doctors and different people and had kids interact, recorded it, questioned them, and looked back at what really happened. And they looked at the answers the kids gave, and they looked at how many times the kids got it right, and they looked at the kinds of questions that the interviewer asked. If there were a lot of suggestive questions, did that mess up the kids' recollections? And the first wave of research showed that kids didn't mess up that much, if at all. That research was not ideal. You had to switch it up a little bit. New research came along that showed kids can mess things up if you do things in a very particular way that the first research didn't look at. We'll look at all that stuff. 79 to maybe 83, 84, a lot of studies that showed that kids are pretty strong when it comes to remembering stuff. Then you had Kelly Michaels and all these daycare cases. New research came, focused on the kinds of questions and the manner in which law enforcement and child protection question kids, and concluded that, you know what? If you got the perfect storm, if you got a lot of bad questions that are repeated, and if you vilify the target of the inquiry, you say Margaret Kelly Michaels is bad, she's molests kids, she belongs in prison. If you talk bad, you ask repeated questions, you do it over and over again over a course of weeks, kids can have false memories, man. Remember something that never, ever happened. I'll show you a video of that. A kid talking about going to the hospital because he got his finger caught in a mousetrap, and his brother was with him, and it was down in the basement of his home where him and his brother were fighting over this little Power Ranger, and he got his finger, this finger, he'll tell you, this one. He got it caught in there, and he went to the hospital, and a nurse came, and this one came, and mommy did this, and daddy said that. It never happened. Now, he's a startling example. When I talk about that, I say to you, what about the 90%, not 90, what about the 80% of kids that didn't have a false memory? Despite our best efforts to inoculate the kid, to stick one in their minds, most kids didn't come up with a false one. That doesn't take away the benefit of that research, though, and we'll look at it too. That is, be careful, because look what could happen. And that's the next wave of research. And the last wave of research in the history of suggestibility kind of is not so much, hey, can we show that kids are strong at remembering stuff? Yes. Can we show that kids can have a false memory, which is really bad? Can we show that? Yeah, we can do that too. The research right now in 2014 is more about how do we take that knowledge and question kids better. Instead of going, aha, you can have a false memory in a kid or you can't have a false memory in a kid. We all agree that you can make false memories. How do we avoid that? What's the best way to question kids? So the research on suggestibility in 2014 is more about better interviewer practice and less about showing that kids' memories can be manipulated or that kids can be very resilient in certain contexts, that is, not have a false memory, even though the interviewer suggests things over and over again. So your timeline, if you will, is Mesmer's in the 1700s, right? 1800s, 1900s, there's some studies there. They actually looked at kids who supposedly were witnesses to homicide. There was a little bit of research about that in the 1900s, the late 1800s, 1900s. You don't have to remember all this stuff, but I'm just trying to give you a chronology. You got Mesmer running around in the 1700s, about the era of Napoleon almost. Napoleon came on the scene in the 1800-ish. Mesmer's in the late 1700s. And then between 1800 and 1900s, 1920, let's say, you have a couple of experiments where they looked at kids who were witnesses to murder, and you had a lot of studies of hypnosis. And hypnosis studies were about trying to get kids to do their homework and trying to get people to stop smoking and lose weight and all that. And then in 1979, then you have advocates like us and people in the universities coming up with experiments. Some of them showed that kids are strong. Some of them showed that kids were weak. They get their finger caught in a mousetrap. 79 to today. That's when there's really been good research on all this stuff. And it continues until today. So any questions about the history or the different models? All right. Here's an article that you have to understand and read if you haven't yet. And it's about children's sexual development. We're looking at, children's development on a number of fronts.
Like my 3-year-old, I remember the day when he enjoyed touching himself.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at him like, what are you doing? Put your hands away. But after because I'm in the field,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of, it was me imposing my views on the kid, right? Because
That's right.
all the kid did was just playing with himself. And there's nothing, I was freaked out by it, right?
Hey, I have a son. He doesn't live with me anymore, but he lives with his biological father. But I was a stepdad for a long time, and I'd walk in the shower, put his flip flops down or whatever. As he was about 8 or 9, he's playing with himself in the shower. Now, the Joe Del Russo, before I was involved in this business, would start yelling, "What the hell's going on? Oh my God, stop!" I don't know what I said, but it was something like, "Listen, let's not spend an hour in a shower here." I go, "We got to go to Grandma's, okay? Hurry up and do whatever you're doing."
But my son is 3, and I was like, whoa.
And your son is 3, you say?
Yeah.
And that's a good point. If you want to know, this is the Phil Rich article, Sexual Development, okay? The takeaway is, you need to read the article, but the takeaway is, children touching their intimate sexual parts is normal.
Yeah.
Masturbation is normal.
Yeah.
Babies masturbate.
Yeah.
There are sensory nerve endings inside our private parts that get stimulated when they get touched. Doesn't matter who's touching them in most cases. They get stimulated. And little kids find them. Some little kids don't find them. And maybe they do and we don't know. Who knows? The point is, masturbation isn't the issue. Self-exploration is not the issue. As a parent and caregiver, you should be mindful of it and make sure that it's not excessive or disruptive. And those are the keys. A child who's excessively masturbates is a problem. A child who masturbates isn't a problem. Not all kids masturbate, but some do. Some kids just touch themselves. That is not unhealthy sexual development. That's healthy sexual development. We know that now. Not a cause for concern. However, I had a poor child once, a little girl, who would masturbate. She's 7 years old, and she couldn't stop masturbating. In fact, one of the reports indicated that she would be in ShopRite or Pathmark or the store, and she'd be rubbing her privates on the cart, on the edge of the cart, and the mother had to scold her in public places. The girl was sexually molested. My case was prosecuting a man for sexually molesting her, and that can happen to kids, and that's what we used to call, and Rich calls them that, sexually reactive children. See? Sexually reactive children are prepubescent boys and girls who have been exposed to or had contact with inappropriate sexual activities. They may engage in a variety of age-inappropriate sexual behaviors as a result of their exposure or to their direct sexual experience, and may begin to act out or engage in those behaviors. What are they? Excessive sexual play, inappropriate sexual comments or gestures, mutual sexual activity with other children, or they sexually molest other kids themselves. Now, when they're 7, you're not an actor. You're not a perpetrator. We don't prosecute 7-year-olds. We identify them as sexually reactive. When a child at age 7 puts his penis on the butt of a 6-year-old playmate, we say to ourselves, who molested you? We see that child as a victim and try to investigate whether that child was in fact molested or somehow was exposed to sexually inappropriate material or behavior. So, as a child advocate who investigates crimes on children and abuse of children in the case of child protection, Here's what you want to be mindful of, okay? And where it's never okay. Any form of sexual activity with children that children engage in is problematic and needs to be followed up on, whether it's sexual activity with each other or with adults or with adolescents and adults. And they say here, for children below age 11, we consider all forms of sexual exposure inappropriate. So anybody age 11 and under, if they're looking at or exposed to sex in some way, whether it be internet video or something else, is inappropriate, and especially for 10 and under. What kinds of things? Exposure to any form of sexual activity, looking at pornography or other sexually explicit material, witnessing sexual behaviors between adults, adolescents, or other children, excessive sexual play with the same age or even older child who has more sophisticated sexual knowledge, any situation in which a child is exposed to explicit sexual materials outside of an educational situation, right? So, we looked at children touching themselves, not a problem. Excessively, or if they say things inappropriately, it doesn't have to be excessive, but if they're masturbating, touching themselves, and the child starts saying graphically sexual things, which I don't need to repeat in here, then that's a problem then, okay? So if there are contemporaneous sexualized statements to the sexual play, then that's a problem. If it's excessive or in public places, like the little girl in my case, then that could be a problem as well. So pay attention to this article. There's more to it than I just talked about, but most of it's about where kids are on the sexual spectrum in their development. And that's what the first part of it is. And then later, Professor Rich talks about things that are per se inappropriate and also describes the sexually reactive child. And, your discussion board was about why understanding child development is important. Well, we don't want to go down the rabbit hole investigating, my kid Daniel who's in the shower. Oh my God, he's playing with himself. There must be abuse here. That's not appropriate. We need to have an articulable basis for opening an investigation. And in order to understand what is abnormal sexual conduct by little kids, one needs to know how they develop sexually. And that'll make us a better interviewer and a more focused interviewer. Any comments about that? All right. All right. Learning Module 1, we're on Learning Module 2. The other thing in Learning Module 2 is where we are now. We looked at sexual development. There's one of the nice handy sheets here is this cognitive milestones, because this is just a bunch of bullet points about what kids ought to be able to do at certain ages. Okay, so this is something you ought to study. Okay, there's a couple of articles and research here that will supplement this, but here's the black and white bullet point version of what kids are able to do between and at certain ages. Okay, so I'm not going to read all those to you or discuss them. Take a look at those. You can see at 5 and 6 they begin to relate clock time to daily schedule, right? That's a big issue in child protection and law enforcement, when something happened and the context and the sequence and those things. And it's not until 5 or 6 that they can even begin to do those things. What's really helpful here is this document I have for you called Child Development Interview Chart. Now, I thought I brought that up. I must have shut it. At the end of the day, here's the child interview chart that'll help you craft questions. Oh, why does it keep doing that? All right, we'll have to do it right within Canvas here. Age of child on left. Question type: who, what, where, when, number of times, and circumstance. That's the law enforcement Bible, if you will, for questioning people, right? That's what you want to know when you're an investigator, detective. Who, what, where, when, number, time, circumstance. You're pretty good if you get all that data. Problem is, with the developing child, you can't get that data. So it's a waste of time in certain contexts. And you'll have to find that information from collateral sources. 3-year-olds can give you who, what, and that's it, man. Maybe a little aware. If they're a higher functioning 3-year-old, maybe a little aware. Forget about when, number of times, and circumstance. 4, 5, and 6. What's interesting here, 7 and 8. Context is still hard for 7 and 8-year-olds. They give you enough. They're the best. 7 and 8-year-olds, jurors love them. They're honest and naive and verbal. And that's good for a witness, right? Jurors love them. Once they start getting to 11, 12, and judges, any fact finder. Judges are a little more savvy than jurors, but any fact finder. 7 and 8-year-olds are great. But even 7 and 8-year-olds have a hard time with context. And even number of times is hard for a 7 or 8-year-old. And I'll teach you how to ask number of times in a very easy way. Okay, I'll tell you right now, once or more than once. The police and law enforcement and criminal prosecutors don't give a damn about exactly how many times. And if we don't care, child protection certainly don't have to have a complete list of how many times in order to protect the child. Okay? And I'll teach you more about how to find out generally the duration and the frequency of molests and physical abuse. But we certainly don't need a specific number. Once or more than once is fine. And then you follow it up by talking about where it would happen generally. Did it ever happen differently? Did someone else do it? You look at different times it may have occurred. First time, last time, time that you remember best, and then you're good to go. But here's really the impact of child development on a questioner. Up to 7 or 8. I think it might go even further. Let me move this thing down because I can't. Yep, 9 and 10. 11, 12 should be able to give. 11 and 12-year-olds, and it also tells us something here too. By the time a kid reaches 11 or 12, they're no more suggestible than adults. We need to be mindful of suggestibility. Most of, if not all, of Franz Mesmer's clients in the 18th century were adults, and they were suggestible. So humans are suggestible, but children, especially 3 through 6, can be very vulnerable to suggestibility. Once you reach 11 or 12, you might as well be dealing with an adult. You don't have to worry that much about suggestibility. And you don't have to worry that much about providing a narrative. Even at 11 or 12, they can even give you circumstance. Okay, so this is a handy little chart to remember that's here and try to pay attention to for this course.
How to get my kids to clean their wounds.
Hypnosis.
I'm like, wait, how do I suggest this to these people? Because it's hard.
Yeah, tell me about it. I hear you. Let's wrap up today by looking at the multimedia here. And this goes back to what we started out talking about. And that is how kids may confuse language, how they can be especially literal, and similar concepts. The first one I call concrete and literal. And we saw a little example of, that's not the video I wanted. We saw an example of a child being very literal just a while ago. What was it that I said? One of you made an observation. I said, that's a kid being very literal. Might have been one of the Art Linkletter kids.
Yeah, say it mad.
Yes, say it mad, Art Linkletter. That's being very literal. Here's an example in the context of a child sexual abuse forensic interview.
This video clip demonstrates how children can be very literal and concrete. To the boy in the clip, boxers and underwear are two very different things. And when the interviewer asked...
Now, something I told you during the housekeeping, make sure you click on this eye up here and read the little thing that I talk about here, right? And one of the things I talk about here is the interviewer, Giselle, says, how were your clothes when something happened? You'll see in a moment. And what she's trying to do is not be suggestive about whether the clothes were on or off. We've abandoned that question formation because, as you can see here, this kid doesn't understand it. It's confusing. For the sake of being non-suggestive, Giselle became confusing. And we learned something else about that because he's describing what the underpants look like. You'll see in a moment, rather than whether they were on or off or something else. So now we simply say, where were your clothes? Or tell me about your clothes, Daddy's clothes, or Grandpa's clothes, or your clothes. And if that doesn't work, we say, well, were Grandpa's clothes on, off, or something else? We ask a multiple choice question after the open-ended question. But anyway, Giselle kind of creates a little confusion here by saying, how were your clothes? I just want you to be aware of that.
Asks him, how were your underwear? Boxers and underwear are two.
Yeah. Okay, what did I do?
Demonstrates how children can be very literal and concrete. To the boy in the clip, boxers and underwear are two very different things. And when the interviewer asks him, how were your underwear, trying to find out if they were on or off or something else, he responds very literally. He says they had pictures of Power Rangers on them.
You said he pulled your pants down. Do you wear something under your pants?
Huh?
Do you wear something under your pants?
You mean under my underwears?
Now, Giselle's question, open-ended? Suggestive? No. In fact, do you wear something under your pants? Right? It's a good question. Most people would say, do you wear underwear? And that's not ideal, but it's normal. But we're forensic interviewers, so she wants to find out if he wears, especially at bedtime. Some kids don't wear things under their jammies. Some kids do. Some kids wear nightgowns, whatever. So she asks him, do you wear some? Which is a great way of asking it.
You mean under my underwear?
I want to hear her say it again. Let's get that. Here.
You said he pulled your pants down. Do you wear something under your pants?
Huh?
Do you wear something under your pants?
You mean under my underwears? No.
Okay. Do you wear underwears?
Yes. And boxers.
And boxers. Okay. Now, were you wearing boxers and underwear that day?
Now, do you wear underwears? Yes. And boxers. Now, I don't know that Giselle picked up on, to him, they're two different things now, right? And boxers.
Like he might not wear them both at the same time.
Well, Giselle's question was, were you wearing underwear and boxers?
That's the question right now.
Yeah, I think so, yeah, which Giselle's getting a little confused here, I think. We'll look at it and see how things pan out. Now, one interpretation of the difference between underwear and boxers to him, and maybe someone else.
Underwear, like Fruit of the Looms.
Tighty whities. Briefs.
Tighty whities.
His boxers might be like shorts that he wears,
Could be. We're speculating. I don't know what it means in his family, that his boy, but that's one interpretation. That's a reasonable one. Underwear could be briefs, and boxers could be the more shorts-like undergarments. Let's see where this takes us, if it takes us in the weeds, because of confusion.
And boxers.
And boxers. Okay. Now, were you wearing boxers and underwear that day?
I was wearing underwear.
You were wearing underwear. Okay.
Yes.
So you said he took your pants down. How were your underwear when he tried to do this to you? How were your underwear when Todd tried to do this to you?
It had Power Rangers on it.
It had Power Rangers on it. Okay, I'm going to write that down too.
We have a saying in forensic interviewing. It's never the kid's fault, okay? It's always a bad question. And we don't say that to be pejorative or say the interviewers are bad, but it's on the interviewer. It's on the interviewer. The kid answers as kids answer. He does a good job, this boy, in clarifying and paying attention. How were your underwear when Dad tried to do this to you? I told you at Jump Street that this was an awkward way of phrasing it. His answer, I think, is accurate. I don't know how were your underwear, so he gives you a description of what they looked like, which I think is more responsive than they were off or on or halfway on the floor to the how question.
What?
Well, listen, we know she could have said it differently. She didn't. So we're learning how. You're right. She should have said, where were your underwear? Where were your underwear when Daddy did this? That'd be better than how. Her goal here is to avoid suggestion. And when you're in there, you got a billion things in your mind. So she went this way. This is just one snippet in 75 questions to 150 or more.
No, I'm not saying that it was bad. I was asking why didn't she say where, as to whether that would be more suggestible as opposed to how.
And I'm saying she said how. I'm not sure what went through her head at the moment, okay. But clearly she's been nicer if she said where or said it differently. But what's good news for us is we learn from mistakes. That's the good news, okay? You know, and the next time we do it differently. We learned how a kid might respond to that formulation of the question here. And wasn't the answer we're looking for, but that's okay. Whoops. Let's just take a look at the
wearing underwear. Okay. So how, you said he took your pants down. How were your underwear when he tried to do this to you? How were your underwear when Tom tried to do this to you?
It had Power Rangers on it.
It had Power Rangers on it. Okay, I'm going to write that down too.
Now, look, the primary reason I put this video on here a couple years ago was boxers and briefs, concrete and literal, right? And he said underwear and boxers are two very different things. You know, we kind of stumbled upon the how were your underwear thing because that's part of the clip I put up there. But my point in showing you that is that kids are very literal, okay? And specific. You know, some kids live in apartments. Some kids live in a trailer. Some kids live in a project. Some kids live in a house. Some kids live on a farm. And you ask them where their house is, they go, I don't live in a house. I live in apartments. Or the trailer. You know, so everybody's situation is different. And the younger they are, they're very specific. They know the thing they live in. And that's one example that comes up all the time. In fact, the formulation for that question in the Finding Words interview was, do you live in a house, an apartment, or something else? Again, understanding that kids are very literal. And, you know, I wasn't in the house when that happened. Geez, every reporter says they were in their house. You weren't in the house? No, I was in my apartment. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yes?
Just made me understand my daughter a whole lot better.
Really? Tell us about that.
She's 7.
I'm listening.
And she sucks her thumb.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I always get her with like the eyes behind my head thing. And I'll see her like do this or see her hands go toward her mouth. And I say, Whitney, stop sucking your thumb. My thumb is not in my mouth, Mommy. I want to say, like, to me, it's like she's being sarcastic, like a smart ass. Mm-hmm. But she's just being literal.
That's right. That's right.
She's not wrong, but to me, it's like. Just
now, she may be being both. She may be doing both if she's high functioning, you know.
Yeah, she's
playing you. So that's okay. But and they are very literal. And they're going to use that against us.
She's like, see, you're getting better.
I'll tell you something else about the real small kids, and then we'll be done for today. Cognitive egocentricity. What I'm talking about is children that are 5 and less. Usually this is resolved by even 3 or 4. But it can last up to 5. Some people would say it can last till you're 50, where you think you're the center of the world, and everything revolves around you. When they say somebody got a big ego, right? That is part of egocentricity. Now, children's universe, especially preschoolers, is mom, right? Dad, and that's it, maybe siblings. Their whole world is filtered through themselves. They can't see the perspective of others. They think the universe turns around them and that what they know and they experienced, everybody else knows and experienced. I'm talking about preschoolers now. You know, if the sink flooded or the toilet overflowed, they think all the neighborhood knows about that the whole world is watching in on them because they're at the center of the universe. And that's called cognitive egocentricity. That's a problem in forensic interviewing. Why do I say that? How can that create confusion when we interview kids? If a child comes in and thinks we know what they know, I mean, what's the point of the interview, right? You know what I know. You were there. I mean, the whole world's there. Everybody knows what happens to me. in a sense. So we need to express to kids repeatedly throughout an interview. You know, you said Grandpa took you in the back shed. I wasn't there, and I don't know what happened when Grandpa took you there. The other thing is they may think Mommy told you already, or you've been briefed as a forensic interviewer. That's another problem where you need to say things like, you know, Danielle, I wasn't there when you went in the shed, so I want to know everything that happened. Tell me what happened in the shed with Grandpa. That also, with the smaller kids, deals with the cognitive egocentricity aspect, in the sense that they think you know this stuff already, and they don't have to give you the whole story. So you need to communicate to them that you don't know the whole story, that you weren't there, that you don't know what they know, but because that's the way they feel. I'm going to show you concrete evidence of that right now. Watch this boy. The interviewer's named Franz. Watch this boy when she interviews him. He's like, you mean you don't know this person? You don't know that person? What do you mean you don't know that person? See, the kid is befuddled that the interviewer doesn't know the people in his life.
But she yelled at me.
Who?
My teacher.
Which one?
The mean one. She's mean. She's like, sit down!
Which teacher is that?
She's mean.
What's her name? She yells at you to sit down? Okay.
You have seen it before? You were at school last night?
No, I haven't met her.
Why not? She's your friend?
No, she's not my friend. I don't know who she is.
You know who my teacher is?
No, I don't know who any of your teachers are.
You know my friend name?
I just know you and your mom.
And you don't know my friend name?
Who's your friend?
Huh?
I don't know him.
This is going round and round, right? And the antidote to that is the remedy is to say what Fran was doing there. I don't know. Maybe even me be a little bit more emphatic about it. Listen, Jimmy, I don't know any people in your life, and I don't know what happened. But I want to know what happened, to find out what really happened.
So I had the same problem. I have a rat problem in my house. We keep the garbage by the house, and I have to. Big old construction. No, it's true, I do. But they're coming in, they're burying in to my porch. So we're fighting the problem.
Right.
Buying all types of stuff. So my son goes to the doctor way there, and they're like, yeah, the rat's in the house. Don't you know the rat's in the house? And I'm thinking like, don't tell everybody we got rats in the house.